Open the briefcase right now, or you're not getting on this flight. The words cracked across the executive security lane like a judge's gavel, loud enough to turn every head inside Terminal C of Reagan National Airport on a cool Tuesday morning. Marcus Ellison didn't react. He simply rested one hand on a worn black leather briefcase that looked older than most of the polished carry-on bags surrounding him and met the security supervisor's stare with the calm expression of someone who had already lived through moments far heavier than this one. Travelers slowed their steps. A businessman in an expensive navy suit smirked and whispered to his companion that people always tried to bluff their way into premium boarding. A woman scrolling through her phone paused long enough to glance up before quietly opening her camera app. The silence inside the checkpoint became charged, the kind that arrives just before a storm no one expects. The supervisor, Richard Collins, folded his arms and nodded toward the briefcase. No ID badge. No corporate credentials. No exceptions. Marcus looked down at the silver combination lock and answered in a voice so steady it almost disappeared beneath the hum of the airport ventilation system. If you're going to handle it, be careful. That sentence drew a few quiet laughs from the growing crowd. Someone muttered that confidence was cheap these days. Another traveler shook his head and said the man probably carried nothing but old paperwork. Marcus never looked toward them. He stood in a plain black polo, faded jeans, and comfortable sneakers that had crossed more airports than anyone watching could imagine. No designer watch reflected the ceiling lights. No luxury luggage announced status. He looked like an ordinary passenger trying to catch an afternoon flight to Chicago. Richard slid the briefcase onto the inspection table with deliberate confidence. "We'll see what's so important," he said, pressing a button for an extended screening. The nearby airline employees glanced over, curiosity replacing routine. A young gate coordinator named Emily Brooks noticed Marcus's expression first. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bargaining or explaining himself. He looked almost patient, as if he had seen this exact scene play out before and already knew how it ended. Emily frowned. Most people argued. Most people reached for documents or demanded supervisors. This man simply waited while strangers built a story about him without asking a single question. Phones slowly lifted around the checkpoint, tiny screens reflecting fluorescent light like rows of silent witnesses. Richard reached for the briefcase lock while the businessman in the navy suit leaned closer, smiling with anticipation. Marcus finally broke the silence, his eyes never leaving the worn leather case. Every person watching this is about to learn the difference between suspicion and truth. The clicking sound of the lock echoed through the checkpoint, and for the first time that morning, even the loudspeaker announcing departures seemed to disappear. Richard Collins slowly turned the first metal latch, and the quiet click seemed louder than every boarding announcement echoing through the terminal. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. The businessman in the navy suit crossed his arms with a satisfied smile, while a woman carrying a rolling suitcase whispered that people always acted confident until someone checked the facts. Marcus Ellison remained perfectly still with both hands resting at his sides, his eyes following nothing except the weathered leather briefcase sitting beneath the bright inspection lights. Emily Brooks felt an unexpected knot in her stomach. She had worked that checkpoint for almost 4 years, and nervous passengers always revealed themselves. They talked too much, searched their pockets, explained things nobody asked about, or laughed at the wrong moment. Marcus did none of those things. He stood with the patience of someone waiting for a train that always arrived on time. Richard lifted the lid a few inches before stopping. Inside rested a perfectly organized stack of dark blue folders, a silver fountain pen, a slim laptop, and a single envelope marked confidential in bold black letters. No loose papers. No clutter. Everything looked deliberate. The businessman leaned closer and chuckled. Probably fake contracts printed at home. A few people around him smiled, comfortable with the assumption before a single page had been read. Emily noticed Marcus glance toward the giant windows overlooking the runway where a line of aircraft reflected the morning sun. His expression never changed. She found herself wondering why someone under suspicion appeared more relaxed than the people examining him. Richard removed the top folder and flipped it over without asking permission. The cover carried an embossed emblem that immediately caught Emily's attention. She had seen it before during executive visits, displayed only when airline board members arrived with security escorts. She blinked twice, convinced she was mistaken, but the symbol remained exactly where it was, pressed into the navy leather with understated confidence. Richard never noticed. He continued speaking loudly for the benefit of the growing audience. If everything is legitimate, you have nothing to worry about. Marcus answered with the same calm voice that seemed untouched by the tension surrounding him. That depends on whether respect requires permission. The sentence lingered in the air as another employee wandered over and several passengers quietly abandoned the regular screening lanes just to watch. More phones appeared. Reflections of tiny recording screens shimmered across polished floors like scattered stars. Emily took one cautious step closer and saw a typed line beneath the airline emblem. She could not read every word, but one phrase stood out with absolute clarity: board review copy. Her heartbeat quickened. She looked from the folder to Marcus and then back to Richard, who was already reaching for the next document with growing confidence. Marcus slowly checked the time on a simple stainless steel watch and exhaled almost silently. "You still have a chance to close that briefcase," he said. Richard smiled without looking up. "Or maybe you have a chance to explain yourself." Emily suddenly realized that only one person in the room sounded completely certain about what was about to happen, and it was not the man standing behind the inspection table. Richard Collins slid the navy folder completely out of the briefcase and placed it beneath the inspection light, as though he expected the pages to expose an ordinary lie. Instead, he found heavy paper, embossed seals, and signatures printed with the precision of documents that had traveled through boardrooms instead of copy shops. He flipped to the first page without asking permission. The businessman standing beside him laughed quietly. "Read it out loud. Let everybody hear what story he invented." Several passengers smiled while others leaned forward, eager for entertainment before their flights. Marcus Ellison never moved. He watched the scene with the same steady expression that had unsettled Emily Brooks from the beginning. She took another cautious step toward the table until she could finally read the bold lettering across the top of the document. Strategic Acquisition Agreement. Her eyes dropped lower. Total transaction value: $800 million. Emily stopped breathing for a moment. She looked at Marcus, then at Richard, who was already scanning the page with growing confusion instead of confidence. The businessman reached across the table and pointed toward the document. "Probably fake numbers. Anybody can print a big contract." Richard nodded quickly, grateful for the suggestion, and picked up another folder. This one carried the same executive emblem, the same polished presentation, and another line that made Emily's pulse race even faster. Authorized board distribution copy number 3. She remembered seeing similar markings during a private executive arrival the previous spring when senior airline leadership had entered through a restricted entrance surrounded by legal advisors. A woman near the front quietly lowered her phone and whispered that the papers looked too professional to be part of a prank. Another traveler answered that appearances could be misleading. The checkpoint became a courtroom built entirely from assumptions. Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm enough to cut through every whisper without rising above conversation. "You are reading documents that were never offered for public viewing." Richard looked up with a forced smile. "Then maybe you should have explained yourself sooner." Marcus simply answered, "Nobody asked who I was. They decided." Emily felt those words settle over the room like a weight. She remembered every executive training seminar that emphasized respect, privacy, and professionalism. None of those principles were visible anymore. More airline employees drifted toward the inspection lane. Boarding agents paused beside the scanners. A pilot walking toward the secure corridor slowed his pace and glanced at the growing crowd. Richard reached into the briefcase again and removed a sealed white envelope marked Final Approval Package. Even before opening it, he looked less certain than before. The businessman who had been smiling since the beginning stopped talking altogether. Emily noticed Marcus glance once more at the simple watch on his wrist before quietly saying, "There are 20 seconds left before someone important realizes where those documents are." No one responded, but somewhere beyond the checkpoint, 3 different mobile phones began ringing at exactly the same time. 3 ringing phones transformed the atmosphere faster than any raised voice could have. Richard Collins glanced at his screen and rejected the call without reading the name. The airline operations manager standing 20 feet away answered his own phone, listened for less than 5 seconds, and immediately looked toward the inspection table with visible confusion. Emily Brooks watched his expression change from routine professionalism to quiet concern. She stepped closer and finally gathered enough courage to speak. "Richard, I think we should stop and verify what we are looking at before opening anything else." He dismissed her with a quick wave. "It is just paperwork." Emily shook her head. "Executive paperwork does not carry board distribution markings unless it is restricted." Her words drifted through the crowd and erased several confident smiles. The businessman who had encouraged every assumption suddenly became interested in the departure board instead of the inspection table. Marcus Ellison remained exactly where he had been from the beginning, shoulders relaxed, eyes calm, breathing steady. He looked less like a passenger under scrutiny and more like someone waiting for a meeting to begin. Emily carefully studied the open folder again and noticed a list of names beneath the transaction summary. One name seemed impossible. Marcus Ellison, lead negotiator. She blinked and read it again. The letters did not change. Her memory raced backward to an internal newsletter she had skimmed months earlier about a confidential acquisition involving one of the largest airline investments in recent history. The accompanying photograph had shown a man wearing a tailored suit and standing beside executives on a stage. The smile had been different, the clothing more formal, but the eyes were unmistakable. Emily slowly turned toward Marcus, and the certainty arrived all at once. She lowered her voice until only Richard could hear. "Close the briefcase now." Richard frowned. "You are overreacting." Emily answered with unusual firmness. "No, I think we are underestimating who he is." Several passengers noticed the exchange and stopped whispering. The room seemed to inhale together. Marcus looked at Emily for the first time since entering the checkpoint and offered the smallest nod, not as approval, but as recognition that someone had finally chosen observation over assumption. The airline operations manager walked rapidly toward the table with his phone still pressed against his ear. He looked at the open documents, then at Marcus, then back to the documents again. The color slowly left his face. Richard reached toward the sealed envelope marked Final Approval Package, determined to prove control over a situation that was quietly slipping away. Before his fingers touched it, Emily placed her hand gently on the edge of the table and said, "Please do not open another document. I believe every page in that briefcase belongs to the person standing in front of us, and I believe every extra second we ignore that fact is creating a problem much larger than this security lane." For the first time since the inspection began, absolute silence replaced every whisper, every laugh, and every confident assumption, leaving only the distant sound of aircraft engines rolling across the runway beyond the glass. Richard Collins stared at Emily Brooks as if certainty alone could erase doubt, but the confidence that had filled the inspection lane only minutes earlier was disappearing one quiet glance at a time. The airline operations manager lowered his phone and spoke carefully. "Richard, leave everything exactly where it is." The instructions sounded simple, yet nobody moved. Marcus Ellison stood beside the table with the same calm posture that had unsettled everyone from the beginning. He looked neither offended nor impatient. He looked like a man who understood that truth always arrived on its own schedule. Richard hesitated for only a second before reaching toward the sealed envelope anyway. "If this is legitimate, there is nothing to hide," he said, breaking the seal while several passengers leaned closer. Emily closed her eyes for a brief moment. When Richard unfolded the first page, the heavy paper reflected the overhead lights and revealed a title that instantly silenced every conversation in the checkpoint. Final Airline Merger Agreement. Beneath it appeared a valuation printed in bold letters. $800 million. Nobody laughed this time. Richard continued reading until his eyes stopped on a signature line carrying the name Marcus Ellison beside the words Executive Principal and Majority Acquisition Partner. His hand lowered almost automatically. The businessman in the Navy suit stepped closer, then stepped back again as though the document itself had changed the temperature in the room. A woman who had been recording quietly lowered her phone without saying a word. Emily opened her eyes and watched disbelief spread through faces that only moments before had been filled with easy judgment. The operations manager carefully accepted the document and examined every page. Watermarks shimmered beneath the inspection lights. Legal seals matched the official corporate registry. Executive authorization numbers appeared at the bottom of every sheet. Nothing looked improvised because nothing was. Marcus finally spoke, his voice steady enough to carry through the entire security area. That agreement will be presented to the board in less than 2 hours. Until this morning, it had never been displayed in a public place. Richard looked up, searching for an explanation that no longer existed. Emily noticed that even the travelers rushing toward nearby gates had slowed down to watch. The checkpoint no longer felt like an airport. It felt like a conference room where assumptions had just lost every vote. The operations manager straightened his jacket and addressed Marcus with visible respect. "Sir, I believe we owe you an apology." Marcus answered without changing his expression. "An apology matters, but understanding why this happened matters more." His words settled over the silent crowd. The businessman who had encouraged every accusation quietly picked up his carry-on bag and avoided eye contact. Emily glanced once more at the agreement resting beneath the bright inspection light and realized the most valuable document in the room was not the contract worth $800 million. It was the lesson unfolding in front of dozens of strangers who had mistaken ordinary clothing for ordinary worth, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any speech ever could. The silence inside the executive checkpoint lasted only a few seconds before it was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching from the private corridor reserved for airline leadership. 2 senior legal advisors, a corporate security director, and an executive assistant carrying a tablet moved through the crowd with quiet urgency instead of panic. Nobody asked them who they were because the confidence in their movement answered the question before words could. The airline operations manager immediately stepped aside, while Richard Collins remained frozen beside the inspection table, still staring at the agreement that had erased every assumption he had made that morning. Marcus Ellison calmly closed the open folder and aligned every page with careful precision, treating the documents with the same respect he had shown from the beginning. The executive assistant stopped in front of him and offered a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Ellison. The board is assembled and waiting for your arrival. The conference aircraft is prepared for departure." Marcus nodded once. "Thank you, Olivia. We experienced an unexpected delay." She glanced at the inspection table, the open briefcase, and the gathering of silent travelers before understanding everything without another explanation. The corporate security director addressed the operations manager in an even voice. "Please preserve the inspection records and security footage for internal review. Nothing is to be deleted or altered." There was no anger in his tone, only procedure, and somehow that carried even greater weight. Emily Brooks watched the exchange with growing respect. She realized that real authority rarely announced itself with volume. It arrived prepared, organized, and completely certain of its next step. Richard finally found his voice. "Sir, I believed I was following protocol." Marcus looked at him with calm eyes that held neither resentment nor satisfaction. Protocol protects people when it begins with facts. It becomes prejudice when it begins with assumptions. Several passengers quietly lowered their phones, embarrassed by the recordings they had started before knowing the truth. The businessman in the navy suit slowly approached Marcus and cleared his throat. "I should not have said what I said." Marcus answered with a simple nod. "Then remember this moment the next time you meet someone who does not fit your expectations." Emily noticed something remarkable. Nobody was defending themselves anymore. Nobody was arguing. The room that had once been full of confident opinions had become a place of quiet reflection. Olivia handed Marcus a secure phone. He listened for a few seconds before speaking. "Tell the board I will arrive on schedule. The agreement is safe and the meeting will proceed exactly as planned." She smiled. They never doubted that. Marcus closed the worn leather briefcase and secured the silver locks with a gentle click that echoed across the checkpoint. The same briefcase that had invited suspicion only minutes earlier now seemed to command the attention of every person in the terminal, proving without a single boast that dignity never depends on appearance and genuine power never needs to raise its voice to fill an entire room. Marcus Ellison lifted the briefcase from the inspection table with the same measured movement he had used when he first entered the checkpoint, and the simple action seemed to restore order to every document that had moments earlier become the center of the terminal. Nobody reached toward it now. Nobody questioned what it contained. The executive assistant quietly organized the remaining folders while the corporate security director confirmed that every page had been accounted for. Richard Collins stood motionless, his earlier certainty replaced by the uncomfortable realization that the entire situation had unfolded because conclusions arrived before curiosity. Marcus turned toward him without hostility and spoke in the calm voice that had carried through every stage of the morning. You searched my briefcase without asking who I was. You opened documents that decide the future of an airline without asking who was trusted to carry them. That is not a security failure. That is a judgment failure. The words landed with more force than any raised voice ever could. Emily Brooks watched Richard lower his eyes before quietly answering. You are right. Marcus looked across the crowd of travelers who had become silent witnesses to a lesson none of them expected to receive before boarding their flights. Every airport welcomes thousands of strangers every day. Most of them will never wear expensive suits. Many will never carry luxury luggage. Some will hold opportunities that can change industries, families, or communities. Respect cannot depend on appearance because opportunity never does. The businessman in the navy suit slowly stepped forward and extended his hand. I owe you an apology as well. I decided who you were before I knew anything about you. Marcus accepted the handshake with a small nod. Then make today useful. The next person you meet deserves the benefit of observation instead of assumption. Emily felt something shift around her as passengers quietly placed their phones back into their pockets. The videos that had begun as entertainment had become reminders of their own first impressions. Even the airline employees standing near the gate exchanged thoughtful glances instead of whispered opinions. Olivia checked the time and smiled gently. The board delayed the meeting by 5 minutes. They said you always arrive with a story worth hearing. Marcus allowed himself the smallest smile of the morning. Then tell them this one ends better than it started. The corporate security director confirmed that the review process would focus on procedures instead of blame, emphasizing that every moment had been preserved so training could improve rather than simply punish. Emily realized that accountability and dignity could exist in the same conversation. As Marcus walked toward the private boarding corridor, sunlight streamed through the terminal windows and reflected across the worn leather briefcase that had inspired so much suspicion. It looked exactly the same as when he arrived. Yet every person watching now understood that nothing about ordinary appearances could ever measure extraordinary responsibility, and the quiet confidence of one man had changed the atmosphere of an entire airport without demanding attention, raising his voice, or forgetting the value of grace. Marcus Ellison had almost reached the private boarding corridor when the airline operations manager quietly asked if he would spare one more minute. Marcus stopped and turned back without hesitation. The request was not for another explanation or another apology. It was for something much simpler. Would you allow my team to learn from what happened here today? Marcus looked across the terminal where travelers had resumed walking but at a slower pace, many still glancing toward the inspection lane that had become an unexpected classroom. Yes, he answered, because mistakes become expensive only when nobody is willing to study them. Richard Collins stepped forward with visible humility. The certainty that had defined his posture earlier had disappeared, replaced by honest reflection. I looked at your clothes before I looked at your conduct. I looked at your briefcase before I looked at your character. I thought I was evaluating risk, but I was really evaluating appearances. Nobody interrupted him. Emily Brooks listened quietly while several airline employees gathered nearby. The corporate security director nodded and addressed the small group. Every policy we enforce begins with professionalism, courtesy, and observation. The order matters. The moment assumptions replace facts, every procedure loses its purpose. A young employee standing near the scanner admitted that he had almost laughed when Marcus first arrived because everyone else seemed convinced something was wrong. Marcus turned toward him with a calm expression. Confidence is contagious. So is prejudice. Every person in this terminal had the opportunity to slow the story down. One person did. His eyes moved toward Emily. She seemed surprised by the attention and quietly shook her head. I only read what was in front of me. Marcus smiled. Exactly. You chose evidence instead of expectation. The operations manager immediately announced that Emily would assist with the next internal training session on customer respect and executive document handling. She looked stunned while several coworkers offered sincere congratulations. Richard extended his hand toward her and thanked her for speaking up when nobody else wanted to question the crowd. The businessman in the navy suit remained nearby, listening without trying to excuse his earlier comments. He finally said, "I travel every week, and I always thought I could read people in seconds." "I was completely wrong," Marcus answered. "The most valuable people in a room often spend the least amount of energy proving they belong there." A quiet murmur of agreement spread through the terminal. Travelers who had never met one another exchanged thoughtful smiles before continuing toward their gates. The inspection table was cleared, the documents carefully secured, and the worn leather briefcase returned to Marcus exactly as it had arrived. Nothing about its appearance had changed, yet everyone who looked at it now saw something entirely different. It no longer seemed like an ordinary case carried by an ordinary traveler. It had become a reminder that extraordinary responsibility rarely announces itself with luxury labels, and that the greatest measure of professionalism is not how quickly someone can identify power, but how consistently they choose to show respect before power is ever revealed. Marcus Ellison finally walked through the private boarding corridor, the worn leather briefcase resting comfortably at his side exactly as it had when he entered the terminal less than an hour earlier. Yet the path behind him no longer belonged to the same morning. Travelers resumed their schedules, boarding announcements returned to normal, rolling suitcases crossed polished floors, and coffee cups changed hands. But conversations sounded different now. A retired teacher waiting near the gate quietly told her husband that she would never again assume success had a uniform. A young college student closed the video she had recorded and decided not to post it because the lesson mattered more than the attention. The businessman in the Navy suit stood alone for a moment before removing the expensive watch from his wrist and smiling at the irony that the most valuable person he had met all year wore nothing that announced wealth. Emily Brooks remained near the inspection lane while maintenance crews prepared the area for the next wave of passengers. The airline operations manager approached her and said that every new employee would hear about what happened that morning, not as a story of embarrassment, but as a standard for professionalism. She looked through the giant windows where aircraft waited beneath a bright American sky and realized that one calm decision had changed more minds than 100 policy manuals. Richard Collins carefully reviewed the inspection log before adding one final note in his own handwriting. Facts before assumptions. Respect before conclusions. Procedure before opinion. He signed his name beneath the sentence, understanding that real accountability begins when excuses end. Inside the executive aircraft, Olivia placed the secure folders on the conference table while board members greeted Marcus with quiet confidence. One director asked if everything had been resolved. Marcus looked through the window toward the terminal where strangers were already disappearing into their own destinations. "Yes," he answered, "and I believe more than one journey changed today." The board meeting began exactly on schedule. The $800 million agreement opened once again, this time in the room where it belonged. Yet the most valuable outcome of the morning could never be measured in dollars or contracts. It lived in a security checkpoint where appearances had lost an argument against character, where one employee chose observation over assumption, where strangers learned that dignity is not confirmed by titles, clothing, or possessions, and where a simple leather briefcase carried far more than documents. It carried a reminder that every person walking through an airport, an office, a hotel, or a boardroom deserves the same respect before anyone knows their story. Marcus closed the agreement, rested his hand on the familiar briefcase, and quietly smiled because true authority had never been inside the papers at all. It had been inside the choice to remain calm when others rushed to judge, proving that the strongest way to change a room is not by raising your voice, but by raising the standard for how people are treated.